She was lauded as Durga, equated with India, and derided a tyrant. She was revered by millions and fanatically disliked at the same time. For nearly 2 decades, Indian politics revolved around a phenomenon called Indira Gandhi. Ruthless, combative, decisive, and yet intensely vulnerable. Indira Gandhi blended achievement with controversy. 25 years after her death, India has still not been able to reconcile the intensely held but extremely divergent views on whether Indira Gandhi was a mere despot or a benevolent leader.
One thing I can tell you with all the words at my command, that she was not at all a dictator or an autocrat.
I think she decimated the bureaucracy. I think she communalized politics.
India is Indra, Indra is India.
I think judiciary was weakened as an institution.
And she was a very, very human individual, very sensitive, very considerate.
She was like a deity for her supporters, but she was a demon for her opponents.
She was very determined and well thought out plans she had in mind.
Indira Gandhi had entered parliament in the year her father and India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru died in 1964. And she took on the job of the Minister of Information and Broadcasting in Lal Bahadur Shastri's cabinet. Though Indira had long been associated with politics, this was the first time that she officially became a part of the government. In 1966, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died of a sudden heart attack in Tashkent, and within the Congress, there began intense, behind-the-scenes lobbying for the Prime Minister's post. The Congress President K. Kamaraj finally had Indira nominated for the post. She was the compromise candidate, a puppet who could be manipulated by the heavyweights of the party. But even then, a rift developed within the Congress party between the socialists led by Indira Gandhi and the conservatives who flocked behind Morarji Desai.
When she became Prime Minister, life was difficult. Her father had a very easy ride. India had become more complicated. The result of the 67 elections were not good. But within 2 years, she got on top of her job.
The old guard had no faith in Nehru's daughter. Veteran freedom fighter Ram Manohar Lohia is known to have called Indira Gandhi a gungi gudiya, a dumb doll. But Indira Gandhi showed extraordinary political skills and tenacity and was to prove everybody wrong. In her first stint, she held the office of the Prime Minister from 1966 to 1977.
At that time, thousands and thousands of young people wanted to flock to the Congress because of Indira Gandhi. So she had that kind of a charisma, the capacity to inspire, and I think I was one of the thousands of people who joined the Congress party.
By July 1969, Indira Gandhi was under siege, fighting for political survival and for leadership of the Congress party. In a strategic move on 16th of July 1969, Indira took away the finance portfolio from principal opponent Morarji Desai, who promptly resigned from her cabinet. Later, through a presidential order issued on 19th of July, she nationalized 14 major banks. The step, said the Prime Minister, would quicken the pace of economic development. By the 1970s, Indira Gandhi's government had fine-tuned a controlled economy to an art form. A stifling array of permits and licenses ruled business. Known as the ubiquitous license permit Raj, it dictated who could produce what how much, and the price they could sell it at. Slowly and surely, there was a sense of discontent that was growing in the country. The Congress had lost its old guard, and newer political formations were being formed. Indira Gandhi had to look for ways and means to stem the tide of unpopularity. And then it was 1971, and there was the Third War with Pakistan. The handling of the war, international diplomacy, and creation of Bangladesh in good measure added to the stature of Nehru's daughter. The Bangladesh War and the decisive victory of the Indian Army overnight transformed Indira Gandhi into a deity. She was compared to the goddess Durga, the slayer of evil, the vanquisher of the devil.
She has been lauded as a decisive leader who gave India its first nuclear explosion and divided Bangladesh and gave Pakistan a message and kept them quiet for from 1971 to about 1989.
But the euphoria of war victory slowly started fading, and common people became more concerned with rising prices and stagnant growth. By 1975, India's economy was in crisis. The economic system had degenerated, inefficiency and corruption had become an inevitable byproduct of the license permit Raj. Jai Prakash Narayan called for Sampurna Kranti, total revolution. The agitation spearheaded by him was in a sense an anti-corruption crusade.
But the politics of Indira Gandhi was not unidimensional. It moved according to which phase of a prime ministership that we are willing to address.
It was around this time too that the verdict came out in a court case against Indira Gandhi. A verdict against her that was to change the course of Indian history. Raj Narayan, the socialist candidate who stood against Indira at Raebareli in the 1971 elections, launched a case against her over election irregularity. 4 years later, at the Allahabad High Court, Justice Jagmohan Sinha was ready to deliver his judgment on 12th of June 1975.
I treat every judgment and every case alike. I never thought that it was a historic judgment. Because if a judge thinks that this is a very important case, then it can sway his judgment.
It was a historical judgment nonetheless, one that found Indira Gandhi guilty on 2 counts of electoral malpractices. It invalidated Indira's elections and disbarred her from office for 6 years. In cities across the country, opposition parties began staging protest rallies against Mrs. Gandhi's rule. The country was coming to a standstill. Sensing the moment was right, the opposition went for the kill. On the evening of 25th June, the opposition parties announced countrywide protests to force Mrs. Gandhi's resignation.
On arrival at Delhi, very late at night, I found a message waiting for me from Mrs. Gandhi saying that you see me tomorrow morning positively. So I arrived here. I arrived at her house about 10:30 on the 25th. There I found her in a very serious mood, looking at heaps of papers and thinking about things. Now those heaps of paper, I gathered, were intelligence reports she had received from time to time. And she told me, Siddharth, we are in a serious situation in India. Everything seems stopped. Working seems to have stopped. Airplanes did not work in time. Nothing worked in time. There was indiscipline everywhere.
Siddharth Shankar Ray helped Indira draft a proclamation. It declared that a grave emergency exists whereby the security of India is threatened by internal disturbances. The President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed signed it just before midnight of 25th June 1975, and for the first time since independence, a state of emergency was declared.
And I said, look, you're closing the high courts. You're taking away electricity. And she said, no, that's not so. And she said, Siddharth, high courts will not be closed and the newspaper connections will not be cut off. But actually, excepting Hindustan Times and Statesman, all the others have been cut off.
But the emergency placed extraordinary power in an extra-constitutional authority, a man largely seen as reckless and arrogant. It was obvious that Mrs. Gandhi's youngest son was being groomed for higher things. Her official blessing on Sanjay as an alternative power center was the signal for the Youth Congress Brigade to unleash what turned out to be a reign of terror. Inevitable stories of excesses began to surface. Sanjay's meteoric rise was helped by the fact that the opposition was silenced and its leaders under arrest and strict censorship enforced. The ruthlessness of the regime came out when George Fernandez, who had gone underground, was finally arrested and produced in court in handcuffs.
It's not just the handcuff. Those handcuffs and chains used to be every day when I used to be brought to the court. I and my colleagues used to be brought to the court. We were 22 of us, and as we were, every morning we had to be brought to the court when the trial began, or earlier in when dates were taken. At that time, plus a chain with which two policemen chained themselves to me, and similarly to other colleagues. That was Mrs. Gandhi's way of telling you that
On 18th of January 1977, Mrs. Gandhi, with her instinct for the dramatic, surprised the world by making an unscheduled broadcast to the nation, announcing the end to the 19-month-long emergency.
The first few months of emergency were very good. It was liked by everybody in the country and even in the abroad. But after that, some things went wrong because certain state leaders, chief ministers and others, in order to take their own ramifications out of their own personal differences, started this. And then, exaggerated manner of this family planning, figures and all the quotas and all that. So certainly things went wrong. She tried to correct all those things, but some or other things went out of the control. And that is how emergency she had to suffer. But she regretted about it.
Fresh elections were announced. Insulated from the public mood, Indira Gandhi had underestimated the hatred of emergency and the opposition strategy. Two months later, in a stunning election outcome, Mrs. Gandhi was swept out of power. Morarji Desai became Prime Minister of the Janata government. Mrs. Gandhi's humiliating defeat was clearly more to do with the excesses of the emergency than popular support for the Janata Party. But within months, the Janata Party itself was in crisis. Indira Gandhi started to attract supporters again.
In 77 we lost, but that didn't mean that Indira Gandhi just sat at home and moped. She immediately went off to campaign in Andhra and Maharashtra where people clung on to her. She wanted them to know, she wanted to reach out to people who had hoped for her, who had prayed for her, who gave her love, that she was still there. An electoral defeat didn't really mean that she was disappearing. And she was able to sustain that hope.
She contested and won a by-election to the Lok Sabha from Chikmagalur, an obscure constituency in Karnataka. George Fernandez actively campaigned against her.
it was the night, there were lights, and I was at a certain point, and their car was going like that. And Mrs. Gandhi said, "Stop," to the driver. And then she pointed out, my hands were showing the shadows were playing on the foliage or whatever, or maybe the screen behind the loudspeaker, whatever, I do not know. And she said, "Look at his hands. Don't you see the devil? Don't you see the devil?" So she was so scared that there was something of the devil in me.
The squabbling leaders of the Janata Party under the leadership of Moraji Desai continued to lose public support. Objection to dual membership to the Jan Sangh constituents and their RSS connections became a serious bone of contention.
When it came to reconstruct the society, these differences of opinion on how to do it was already there from Jan Sangh to Socialist Party, and also the communists were in that experiment to re-establish democracy. So it was obvious that there should emerge certain differences, and the Janata Party could not reconcile with the ideological differences that were inherent in the very formation of the Janata government.
Two successive socialist governments collapsed, leaving the path clear for Indira Gandhi to storm back to power. And 34 months after her electoral defeat, Mrs. Gandhi was back as the Prime Minister after the 1980 elections. By June that year, her heir apparent and her youngest son, Sanjay, had died in a plane crash. More than 300,000 people crowded the streets of Delhi for one of the grandest, even if unofficial, funerals ever organized. No one asked where the son would be without his mother. They asked, rather, where the mother would be without his son.
She was overwhelmed by grief, and she had derived a lot of spiritual sustenance and strength from some of her friendship with some great religious leaders whom she respected very highly.
After Sanjay Gandhi's death, something died inside Indira Gandhi. Though her iron resolve and her determination to work carried her through for the next 4 years of her life that remained. This was the period when separatism and insurgency had Punjab in a stranglehold. And the Prime Minister tried everything to bring the state back to normalcy. Her brand of politics included playing favourites and trying to prop up one faction to bring down the other. But all her political manoeuvring was not enough to drive out the extremists from the Golden Temple. In June 1984, confronted by a burning Punjab, she ordered the army to storm the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Sikhism's holiest shrine had been occupied by heavily armed separatists led by Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. His call for Khalistan had created the most serious internal security problem since independence. The assault on the temple and the use of tanks and heavy artillery damaged portions of the Akal Takht and inflamed Sikh sentiments. The threat to the Prime Minister's life increased dramatically.
The mandate that she gave to the army after trying the police, after trying negotiations at all levels, after herself leading the negotiation, then after trying the police, after intervention of President's rule, she came to the conclusion, after Bhindranwale occupied the temple, that there was no other way but to have a military type of approach to find a solution.
I do not think her decision to do Operation Blue Star in '84 was particularly necessary. I think that was overreaction. I think Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale could have been dealt with without the symbolic and real presence of the army attacking the symbol of the reverence in Sikhism. It's not well known, but after Operation Blue Star, units of the army revolted. Never before had this happened in the Indian Army, and never again, I thank God, has it happened. The repercussions were huge, huge.
31st October 1984, Mrs. Gandhi was running 15 minutes late for her appointment with British actor Peter Ustinov, who had arrived for a television interview. She stepped out from the rear of her residence and hurried down the paved path she took each day to 1 Akbar Road. She paid little heed to the 2 Sikh guards posted at the gate separating the 2 bungalows. It was 9:16 a.m. Then, before she could pass through, Sub-Inspector Byan Singh took out his pistol and fired 5 bullets into her body. From the other side of the gate, Constable Satwant Singh stepped out and emptied his Thompson carbine into the figure sprawled on the ground.
I shudder to think of the moment of the 31st October 1984 when our own security guard killed her. I mean, say it plunged. That was if I may say so, that was and will remain the darkest day in the history of the country, when it plunged the entire nation into a sea of grief.
She became a cult really after her assassination, which was the ultimate price.
One felt suddenly there was a sense of disbelief and also a sense of great vacuum. What next? What will happen?
She became much more powerful and much more respectful after her death. Before her death, I think she was hated for emergency. She was hated for all the economic bankruptcy of the country.
At 2:30 p.m. on 31st October 1984, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, was officially declared dead.